They thought he was untouchable, the brilliant young CEO with a glass tower empire and the city at his feet. But all it took was a 6-year-old girl holding a faded photograph on a crowded Manhattan street to shatter his world and force him to remember the family he never knew he had. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the journey all the way to Chapter 10. The evening rush in Midtown Manhattan had its own pulse. Taxis blaring, bus brakes screeching, briefcases bumping against coats, heels striking pavement in staccato rhythms. People surged forward as one living tide, each face turned away from the rest, everyone guarding their own hurry. Ethan Walker moved among them like a shadow dressed in precision. His navy suit carried the sharp lines of a man who measured everything. At 32, he was the prodigious CEO of Walker Global Holdings, the kind of name that lit up Bloomberg tickers and silenced boardrooms when he spoke. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest control without rigidity, and the glow from the skyscrapers caught on his dark eyes, eyes that concealed more than they revealed. But the city's rhythm faltered when he heard it, a child's voice, fragile yet insistent. "Sir, do you know this man?" He turned. The crowd seemed to thin, as if the noise parted around a single small figure. A girl, no more than 6, stood at his knees. Her chestnut hair was pulled into 2 uneven braids, her shoes scuffed, her dress too light for the March chill. She held out a photograph with both hands, fingers trembling as though it carried the weight of the world. Ethan's first instinct was dismissal. Another child fundraiser, another performance staged to tug at strangers' wallets. But the photograph stopped him cold. It was old, its edges worn soft by time, its creases stitched with tape. The image showed a younger Ethan, though he did not immediately recognize himself. His arm wrapped around a woman whose face blurred at the fold. In his other arm was a newborn swaddled in a hospital blanket. The air in his lungs turned heavy. I'm sorry," Ethan managed, his voice ironed flat for strangers. "Where did you get this?" The girl's eyes, clear and blue, locked onto him without flinching. "Mom says this is my dad. She told me to find him. She said, he looks just like you." The words struck harder than any hostile takeover. For years, Ethan had tolerated attempts by strangers to claim him. Fraudulent heirs, invented cousins, fabricated mistresses. He had lawyers for that. But this child's conviction wasn't a lawsuit. It was a plea. "You're mistaken," he said, crouching slightly, attempting gentleness. But the girl tilted her head, studying him as though she were reading a truth inscribed under his skin. Then she whispered, "You have the same mole under your eye, just like my daddy." Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the small mark beneath his left eye, a brown fleck he had carried since birth. His pulse thundered. This wasn't possible. He had no wife, no child, no life beyond contracts and glass towers, at least none he could remember. "What's your name?" he asked carefully. "Sophie," she answered, clutching the photo tighter. "Sophie Miller." Her surname landed without recognition. He searched his mind, but his memory was a room with locked doors. He saw flashes, sirens, light through glass, a sterile hallway, but no faces, no continuity. "Where's your mom?" Ethan asked. "In Brooklyn," Sophie said. "She told me if I ever saw you, I should give you this." She pushed the photograph into his palm. The paper burned against his skin. For years, Ethan had dismissed the blank spaces in his past. His doctors called them stress fractures from the accident 2 years ago, an accident he rarely spoke about. He had learned to bury those gaps under schedules, mergers, and market projections. But here, embodied in a child's trembling hands, was proof that the gaps were not empty at all. "I don't know who you think I am," he whispered, almost pleading with himself. "But I'm not your father." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, though she bit them back with a resolve far older than 6. Yes, you are. Mommy said you'd be scared. She said you'd try to forget. But I know it's you. Ethan's chest tightened. The child's certainty was unbearable. Her gaze stripped away the armor he wore before investors and reporters. Somewhere deep inside him, a part of him recognized her, even if his mind refused. He stood abruptly, returning the photograph. "I'm sorry," he said, voice clipped. "I have to go." He turned into the crowd, trying to let it swallow him, but her voice pierced the rush once more. "You promised me once you'd never leave." His stride faltered. Ethan spun back, shaken, but Sophie was already retreating, her small figure absorbed by the river of people. He remained frozen on the sidewalk, breath shallow, the city glaring neon around him. In his hand, the photograph felt heavier than any acquisition. He couldn't remember Sophie. He couldn't remember the woman in the picture. But the photograph existed, and so did she. For the first time in years, Ethan Walker, the man who built empires from certainty, felt the foundations of his life quake under the weight of a memory he did not possess. The subway rattled beneath the streets of Manhattan as Ethan's chauffeured car crossed the Brooklyn Bridge. Normally, his evenings belonged to forecasts and board memos, but tonight, his mind carried only a photograph and the voice of a child who swore he was her father. The lights of Midtown faded in the rear view, replaced by brick facades and narrow streets that breathed a different rhythm, one he had not set foot in for years, or perhaps ever. The address had been scribbled in shaky handwriting on the back of the photo. Hicks Street, Brooklyn Heights. Ethan had no reason to follow it. He should have dismissed the girl, let his lawyers field any claims. And yet, here he was, his driver glancing at him in the mirror with silent questions. "Stop here," Ethan ordered, his voice rougher than usual. He stepped out into the evening air. The building was modest, its bricks weathered by rain and time. A fire escape zigzagged across the front, casting sharp shadows against faded red. Laundry lines stretched between windows. This was no place for the CEO of Walker Global Holdings. It was, however, the place where truth waited. He climbed the steps, each one heavier than the last. His hand hovered above the buzzer before he finally pressed. The door opened a crack. A woman stood there, framed by the dim hallway light. She was slender, auburn hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, her sweater plain, her jeans worn. But her eyes, amber-flecked, sharp with recognition, stopped him cold. Her lips parted as though the sight had knocked the breath from her. Then her voice came, low and disbelieving. "Ethan?" The name landed like a strike against his chest. He hadn't told her who he was. She knew. His words faltered. He steadied himself with the steel of habit. "Grace?" The name had risen from somewhere buried. He didn't know how he knew it, only that it felt true. Grace Miller's face hardened. "You came back." Ethan blinked. Back? Her jaw clenched. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "You should come in. Sophie's waiting." The apartment was small but warm. A crocheted throw rested across the couch, bookshelves leaned under the weight of children's titles, and on the table lay an open library copy of Treasure Island. Ethan's pulse jumped at the sight, though he couldn't explain why. Sophie appeared in the hallway, teddy bear pressed to her chest. "Mommy," she whispered, "it's him." Grace pulled Sophie close, her hand trembling against the child's shoulder. "Go wash up, honey. I'll talk to him first." Sophie obeyed reluctantly, casting one last glance at Ethan before slipping away. The silence left behind was unbearable. Grace crossed her arms, Her eyes locked on him. So this is your game? You vanished for 2 years, and now you stand here pretending you don't know us? Ethan felt the words cut deep, sharper than any shareholder's accusation. I'm not pretending. I don't remember. Grace laughed bitterly, a sound scraped raw by years of hurt. Don't remember? You looked me in the eye before you left and told me I had ruined everything. You walked out without a word to your daughter. You shut every door. And now you expect me to believe you've simply forgotten? His chest tightened. 2 years ago, there was an accident. A crash. I was told I suffered memory loss. Partial retrograde amnesia, the doctors called it. I remember boardrooms, contracts, quarterly numbers. But my personal life, he shook his head. It's blank. Grace's eyes shimmered, though she refused to let them spill. So that's the story you're selling now. That you're some tragic victim. That you didn't abandon us. You just misplaced us. It's not a story, Ethan insisted, desperation rising. It's the truth. I didn't even know you or Sophie existed until yesterday. Grace's hands clenched into fists. Do you know what that did to her? Every birthday, every school play, she asked where you were. I told her you were busy. I told her you cared. I lied to keep her heart from breaking. The word struck harder than any financial loss. Ethan's carefully constructed world of logic and strategy crumbled in the face of this simple truth. He had caused pain without even remembering how. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly. I just want to understand. Please, help me remember. Grace stared at him, torn between fury and something softer she tried to bury. Her voice, when it came, was brittle. If you truly don't remember, then you should leave. Because standing here, looking at me like a stranger, hurts more than your absence ever did. Ethan's throat constricted. He opened his mouth, but no words came. At that moment, Sophie returned, unable to stay away. Her eyes darted between them, sensing the storm. Mommy, don't cry, she whispered. Then she looked at Ethan, her voice trembling but steady. Daddy, please don't go again. The word daddy cracked something inside him. He staggered back a step, overwhelmed. Grace knelt quickly, pulling Sophie into her arms. Sweetheart, don't. But Sophie's gaze stayed fixed on him, her certainty unshaken. Ethan felt himself unravel. The CEO armor was useless here. All he had was a fractured memory, a photograph, and a child who believed in him despite it all. I don't deserve that word, he whispered. Not yet. Sophie's small voice answered, You don't have to deserve it. You just have to stay. Grace closed her eyes, tears finally slipping free. Ethan stood frozen, every instinct torn between retreat and surrender. The city hummed faintly through the window. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of Manhattan blinked like signals he could no longer read. For the first time since the accident, Ethan Walker faced not a hostile board, not a rival company, but something far more terrifying. The life he might have lost, and the family he might still reclaim if memory, trust, and time allowed. The city never slept, but it had its quiet hours. In the deep of night, when the roar of taxis faded and even Wall Street seemed to exhale, Ethan Walker found himself walking the sterile corridors of NYU Langone Medical Center. The hospital was both familiar and foreign. He had been here before, though he couldn't place the when or why. His chest tightened as he passed the emergency wing, a ghost of memory tugging at him, then vanishing before it could take shape. He had told Grace the truth. He didn't remember. But memory loss no longer felt like an accident. It felt engineered. And tonight, he was determined to see if the records could confirm that suspicion. The records office smelled faintly of toner and old paper, though nearly everything had been digitized. His legal team's authorization had opened a door few could walk through. At the counter, a weary clerk glanced at the order and handed him a slim folder. "Keep it in the room," she warned. "These don't leave the premises." Ethan nodded, though his pulse thudded. He carried the folder into a small, windowless room where a fluorescent light buzzed overhead. A metal table waited like a witness stand. He sat, opened the file, and let the past stare back at him. At first, the pages were clinical. Blood pressure, heart rate, intake notes. He skimmed them with the precision of a man used to quarterly reports. But then something caught his eye. A progress note dated 2 years ago, time-stamped less than 6 hours after the crash. Patient disoriented, oriented to place and time, denies family or dependents. The words made his breath hitch. Denies family? That didn't sound like confusion. That sounded like erasure. He turned the page, hunting for consistency. Another note, different physician, same night. Patient asked repeatedly for phone. Reported wife named Grace, mentioned infant daughter. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He compared the 2 pages side by side. Same date, same shift, opposite realities. And then he saw it. Tiny metadata tags at the bottom of the printout, usually invisible in digital records but captured here. Edits. One note showed 2 revisions, the most recent not by the attending physician but by an external login. Initials, R.H. Richard Hale, his CFO. Ethan's jaw clenched, the fluorescent light seeming suddenly harsher. He scanned further, and again the initials appeared. Attached to an administrative audit that had overwritten references to family with the bland phrase, "no dependents documented." His fingers curled against the paper. He remembered Richard's steady smile, the way he had smoothed quarterly calls during Ethan's recovery, always speaking of continuity, stability, loyalty. And now his initials sat like fingerprints over Ethan's most fragile truth. For the first time, the accident felt less like fate and more like design. A knock startled him. The clerk peeked in. "Everything okay?" Ethan forced composure into his voice. "Yes. Just slower reading than I expected." She nodded and withdrew. Alone again, he pressed both hands against the table, grounding himself. His mind replayed Grace's accusations, Sophie's unwavering certainty. He had doubted himself, but now doubt shifted outward. If Richard Hale had tampered with medical records, what else had been manipulated? Emails? Contracts? The very reasons he had walked away from his family? He flipped to the discharge summary. It was concise, efficient, stripped of detail, too stripped. No mention of confusion, no mention of Grace. Just a sterile exit. It read more like a corporate memo than a medical document. His stomach turned. He closed the file carefully. But the silence of the room no longer felt sterile. It felt complicit. He rose, carried the folder back to the desk, and signed the checkout sheet with a hand that trembled slightly. Outside, the night air was cold, biting against his face. He stood on the steps of the hospital, the skyline rising beyond the East River. For years he had trusted numbers, systems, reports. Tonight, those systems had betrayed him. His driver pulled up, but Ethan didn't get in right away. He stood beneath the streetlight, clutching the memory of those initials burned into paper. For the first time since the crash, clarity cut through the fog. This wasn't just amnesia. This was theft. He slid into the car, voice hardening with resolve. Take me home. But home no longer meant the penthouse or the glass towers of Midtown. Home meant something broken in Brooklyn. A child's trust, a woman's guarded eyes. And now he had proof that someone had tried to erase them. The cracks had begun to show, and Ethan Walker intended to widen them until the whole truth spilled out. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time Ethan reached Brooklyn again. Streetlights bloomed halos on the wet pavement, and the stoops along Hicks Street wore a silver sheen. He hesitated at the bottom of Grace's building, feeling the tug-of-war inside him. One rope wound tight with guilt and uncertainty, the other pulled taut by a 6-year-old who had called him daddy without flinching. He buzzed. Footsteps. The door unlatched. Grace opened it only halfway, the chain still riding the groove. "You shouldn't be here this late," she said, voice low, controlled, the kind of calm people learned when storms lived in their walls. "I won't stay long," Ethan said. "I needed to see Sophie." He swallowed. "And to try again. Differently." The chain slid. He stepped into warmth that smelled faintly of soap and tomato, and something else he couldn't name, something that landed just behind his ribs like a soft knock. The living room glowed with lamplight. On the coffee table, a scatter of crayons and paper had colonized the surface. Along one edge, a page torn from a spiral notebook bore a single sentence in a child's block letters. "Stars are promises." Sophie burst from the hallway as if propelled by the word. "You came back," she said, small hands clasping and unclasping. "I said I wouldn't stay long," Ethan answered, and then caught himself, hearing how thin that sounded. "But I'm here." She grabbed his sleeve and tugged him toward the couch. "I made drawings, for you, so you can remember even if your head doesn't." Grace started to protest. "Sophie, it's late." But the words softened in her mouth. She sank into the armchair, arms folded across herself as if to keep hope from escaping or sneaking back in. Sophie spread the pages with a curator's solemnity. The first showed 3 stick figures under a lopsided moon. The tallest had a scribbled dot under one eye. "That's you," she announced, tapping the mole. "And that's Mommy, and that's me. We're at the park. You pushed me so high I could hear the moon hum." Ethan's mouth lifted before he could stop it. "Does the moon hum?" "Yes," Sophie said with the certainty of people who have not yet learned to doubt wonder. "You said everything hums if you get quiet enough to hear it." Something in his chest shivered, like a tuning fork struck in a room he had forgotten. He didn't recognize the memory, but his body leaned toward it. He lowered himself onto the couch. The second drawing was a boat, a square sail, a crooked Jolly Roger, a blue scribble sea. "Treasure Island," she said. "You did the pirate voices wrong, but you tried. Mommy laughed because you made Long John Silver sound like a weatherman." Grace snorted, one hand briefly covering her smile. "I told you your Midwestern vowels would betray you." "I'm from Ohio?" Ethan asked, eyebrows lifting. "No," Grace said, the smile gone almost as quickly as it had arrived. "But your vowels are." He absorbed that, a stray thread from a sweater he might one day re-knit. "Read me one of your pirates," he said to Sophie. She puffed out her chest and lowered her voice. "Ahoy," she growled, then dissolved into giggles. "I forgot the rest." "That seems familiar," Ethan said. The laughter worked on him like a solvent, loosening something rigid. The third drawing was a bed with small stars scattered above it. Sophie's handwriting looped in purple along the top. "Good night, Captain." Beside the bed, a figure with a ridiculous number of hands, at least 6, held a book, a cup, a teddy bear, a blanket, and, inexplicably, a wooden spoon. "You said real captains have to be good at lots of things," Sophie explained, "like carrying and reading and fixing and stirring oatmeal. So I gave you more hands." Ethan blinked hard. "That sounds like something I'd say." "You also said," she continued, turning very serious, "that the stars are like promises. Even when we can't see them, they're still there. So when you didn't come back, I looked out the window anyway because you said it was okay to trust the sky for a while. Grace's head tilted just slightly. A muscle in her jaw moved. The room tightened around the sentence, as if the walls had leaned in. Ethan reached for the paper with careful fingers. The stars were crude, five-pointed shapes, each colored in with frantic little strokes, as if the force of coloring might make them shine for real. His throat burned. "Did I make that up?" he asked, voice thin. "The stars?" Grace's answer came softly. "You stole it from an astronomy podcast and made it sound like a lullaby." He huffed something like a laugh. Then he caught it. A scent, maybe, or a warmth, or the rhythm of the apartment's old radiator. The sensation didn't become a picture, but it spoke in a language older than images. His shoulders lowered without permission. He pressed the heel of his hand to his sternum, surprised by the ache that wasn't pain. Sophie was already onto the next page. A kitchen, a pot on the stove, stick-figure steam curling up like musical notes. "Oatmeal," she declared. "Mommy says yours is wrong, but I like it better because you put cinnamon and pretend it's treasure." "You called the raisins doubloons," Grace said, reluctant amusement pulling one corner of her mouth. "I did?" Ethan asked, hovering between embarrassment and a quiet pride he didn't understand. "That's absurd." "It worked," Grace said. "She ate breakfast." Sophie leaned in, conspiratorial. "Sometimes you burned it. We didn't tell." "I'm reporting both of you to the Breakfast Authority," Ethan said, and the sentence surprised him by existing in his mouth, fully formed, like a room that had been there all along behind a door he hadn't seen. Grace looked away, and for a flicker he saw not the armored woman from the doorway, but the person who had once let him make pirates sound like weathermen. The moment passed. She tugged the sleeve of her sweater down to her wrist. Sophie dragged over a shoebox she had repurposed with stickers. Inside, objects lay like artifacts from a sunken ship. A ticket stub with a torn corner, a flattened penny pressed with the outline of a lighthouse, a Polaroid so overexposed that only the suggestion of faces remained. She handed the Polaroid to Ethan. "We took that on the ferry," she said. "The wind made my hair look like spaghetti. You said we were sea people now, and Mommy said the sea didn't want us if we couldn't fold laundry." Grace's cheeks colored. "That was a Tuesday." "How do you know?" "I only joke like that on Tuesdays," she said, and the room laughed. A small thing, but real. Ethan folded forward, elbows on knees, the Polaroid trembling between his fingers. There was almost nothing to see, just light and a corner of sky, but his body remembered the angle of the ferry bench, the jerk of a gull landing on a railing, the salt sting in his throat that wasn't from the wind. He fished into his coat pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. He had begun carrying it after his last appointment, a form of homework that felt less like therapy and more like reconnaissance. He clicked it on and spoke quietly, almost to himself. Note: ferry, salt air, laughter on my left, child weight in lap. Phrase: stars are promises, appears in multiple contexts. Physical reaction, chest heat, throat tightness, emotion. Familiar. Sophie watched with fascination. "Are you making a podcast?" "I'm making a map," he said, "in case my head loses the road again." "Maps are good," she said. "But also, I could just tell you where things are." Grace's eyes glistened and she blinked fast. The clock over the stove ticked past 9. "Sophie," she said gently, "bed." "2 more," Sophie bargained, already shuffling drawings. "Half of 1, Grace countered. Sophie held up a page with 3 stick figures on a stoop. This stoop, beneath a rectangle meant to be the sky. In the top corner, a star larger than the others beamed long rays down on the smallest figure. "This one is called We Stayed." Grace's mouth parted. Ethan could not speak. Sophie hopped off the couch with the self-assurance of a tiny general. She returned a moment later with a blanket patterned with planets and tucked it into Ethan's lap. "This is for when your legs forget," she said. "It helps you remember to stay." He laughed helplessly. "Do my legs do that often?" "They like to run away," she pronounced. "They think they're in the Olympics." She climbed into the narrow space beside him with the authority of someone who had sat there many times and might again. Her head found his shoulder as if by magnet. Grace stood. "Bed," she repeated. But it was weaker now, and no one moved. "Just 1 minute," Ethan said. "Please." Grace's gaze met his, measured, wary. A touch of surrender threaded through. She nodded toward the hallway. 1 minute, then teeth. Sophie closed her eyes. The apartment hummed, radiator, streetlight buzz, a neighbor's faint music below. Ethan's hand hovered before it settled lightly on his daughter's hair. He did not command it. The gesture happened to him. The softness under his palm sent a brightness through his chest that made him both hopeful and afraid. He didn't sing. Not yet. The tune hovered like a bird on a wire, almost landing, then flicking away. He let the silence hold them. After a while, Sophie mumbled, "Good night, Captain," and slipped off the couch, obedient at last. Grace waited at the doorway to the small bedroom. "Say good night," she prompted. "Good night," Ethan said, then added, "I'll be here tomorrow." The sentence surprised him as much as it surprised her. "We'll see," Grace replied, not unkindly. Sophie vanished with a flurry of whispers and the brush of planets against the carpet. The bedroom door clicked with a soft finality. In the quiet that followed, Grace faced him across the coffee table. The page that read, "Stars are promises," lay between them like a contract that required no signature. "I don't know what happened to us," Ethan said, the recorder dark in his hand. "But I know this. I said those words once, and I meant them. I want to mean them again." Grace's expression shifted, a weather pattern moving over water. "Words were never the hard part," she said. "Time is." "Then I'll bring time," he answered. "Not money, not apologies on embossed stationery. Time." She considered him for a long breath. "Pick her up from school tomorrow," she said finally. 3:15, don't be late." Something in him unclasped. "I won't." As he stepped into the hall, he tucked the drawing with the stars inside his coat. The paper crackled against his heart like a small fire. On the stoop, he paused, looking up. The Brooklyn sky was a dull gray, city-bruised and stingy with light. No stars visible. He stood anyway, letting the damp air bead on his skin, and felt, in the space memory had not yet refilled, the steady hum of something that might one day be a song. The morning after the drawings, Ethan returned to Walker Global Holdings with the same mask he had worn for years. His suit was pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, his stride precise enough to reassure anyone watching that nothing in his life was out of order. But beneath the surface, disorder reigned. He could not shake the memory of Sophie's small hand pressing a blanket into his lap, whispering that his legs sometimes forgot to stay. Inside the building, silence carried the weight of power. Carpets absorbed footsteps, glass walls, muted voices. Ethan stepped into his office with the practiced calm of a man who belonged here. Yet the papers on his desk blurred. His thoughts kept circling back to the initials carved into hospital records, the crude star in Sophie's drawing, and the unshakable suspicion that he was being observed more closely than any CEO should be. A knock interrupted him. When he called out, the door opened to a man in a charcoal suit, an ID badge swinging at his belt. He introduced himself as IT support, explaining there had been a network flag. He needed to scan Ethan's system. It was a thin pretext, and Ethan's instincts caught it. The man's eyes swept the office too deliberately, lingering not on the computer, but on the folders stacked neatly on the desk. "Leave your card," Ethan said coldly. "I'll schedule something later." The man hesitated for half a beat before plastering on a smile. Of course. He set a card on the desk and turned. Ethan didn't touch it. From the window, he watched as the man bypassed the IT department completely and slipped into the stairwell. Ethan moved before he had time to think. He left his office, ignored his assistant's questions, and pushed into the stairwell. The air smelled of dust and metal. He heard footsteps below, quick and urgent. "Hey!" His voice rang off the concrete walls. The man looked back once. Recognition flickered. Then he bolted. Ethan chased, the pounding of his shoes echoing against steel. He was no stranger to pressure, but this was different from quarterly earnings or hostile shareholders. His body burned, lungs scraping, yet something deeper propelled him forward. The thought of Grace, of Sophie, of lives already erased from his records once before. The stairwell spat them into a maintenance corridor lined with pipes. The man shoved through a heavy door, and the scent of oil and exhaust rushed in. They had reached the garage. A black sedan idled with headlights glowing. The man sprinted for it. Ethan launched himself forward, slamming the man against the hood before he could reach the handle. Papers spilled from his jacket pocket, contracts stamped with the Walker Holdings seal, but annotated with unfamiliar numbers. Among them, Ethan caught a hurried scrawl. Board transfer, Hale, Collier. Richard Hale. Paige Collier. The board. "Who sent you?" Ethan demanded, pressing the man harder against the car. The man twisted, shoving back with surprising strength. Ethan stumbled. In a blur, the stranger dove into the sedan. Tires screeched, the engine roared, and headlights flared. Ethan barely threw himself aside as the car tore past, vanishing into the city's veins. His chest heaved as he stooped to retrieve one of the fallen pages. He tucked it into his jacket, every nerve alive with dread. Someone had sent an operative into his office. Someone on the inside. And the notes confirmed his worst fear. Richard Hale was not merely covering tracks. He was shifting control of Ethan's empire itself. Back in his office, Ethan stared at his reflection in the glass wall. The man who looked back wore authority, but authority meant nothing if the ground beneath it had already been sold. His fortress of steel and stock tickers was compromised. He thought of Grace struggling in Brooklyn, Sophie sketching stars over their heads to make sure he wouldn't get lost. He thought of hospital files rewritten by a hand he had once trusted. That night, he returned to the apartment on Hicks Street with the weight of the day pressing down like a storm. Sophie was waiting, crayons scattered around her again. She lifted a new drawing proudly, 3 stick figures beneath a crooked skyscraper. A single star hovered above, shining down. "This is you at work," she explained. "The buildings are big, so I gave you a star. Stars help people find the way." Ethan knelt beside her, studying the paper. The crayon tower leaned precariously, the star's light stretching across it. His throat tightened, and he could barely manage the words. "It's perfect, Sophie." She beamed, climbing onto his lap as if she had always belonged there. Grace stood in the doorway of the small kitchen, arms folded but her eyes softening despite herself. Ethan held the drawing carefully, as though it were fragile glass. In the chaos of contracts and conspiracies, this was the one map that mattered. Sophie's certainty, Grace's reluctant tolerance, his own desperate need to remember, it all converged here. He pressed his forehead briefly to the crown of his daughter's hair. Quietly, so only he could hear, he made a vow. They won't erase us again. The radiator hissed, the city hummed beyond the window, and in that small apartment, Ethan clung to the fragile promise that not even Hale or Collier could rewrite forever. The rain had washed the city clean by morning, and a pale ribbon of light threaded between the towers as Ethan crossed the river toward Brooklyn. He carried no briefcase, wore no boardroom armor, just a wool coat, the collar turned up against the lingering chill. He had texted Grace 2 words before leaving Midtown. After school? Then hovered over his phone like a teenager, relieved when her reply came back short and neutral. 3:15. Don't be late. He wasn't. He arrived early and stood across from the schoolyard watching children pour through the gate like bright marbles. Parents clustered in loose knots, exchanging weather and homework and the small commerce of neighborhood life. He felt like an imposter at a ceremony he once helped invent but could no longer officiate. Then he spotted her, Sophie, hair escaping its braid, knees a little muddy, backpack bumping against her spine as she ran. "Hi," she announced, stopping just shy of collision as if a small, invisible brake had engaged. "You're not late." "I'm not," he said, a smile surprising him. "Permission to walk you home, Captain." "Permission granted," she said, as if handing him a passport. They moved down the sidewalk together. Sophie narrated everything. The dog that always barked at her but not at Mrs. Doyle, the mailbox with stickers, the tree that looked like a giant hand. When they reached the stoop, she bounded up the steps, and instead of going inside, turned and sat 2 stairs above him, studying his face with the sober gravity of children who know more than they are asked to carry. "Mom said you could pick me up today," she said. "That you asked, not your helper." "I don't have a helper for this," Ethan replied. "I don't want one." "That's good," she declared, and hopped to her feet. "I have something." Inside, the apartment smelled of coffee and laundry. The living room lamp was on, though it was still daylight, casting a warm circle over the couch and the small universe of crayons and paper on the table. Sophie dove into a room and came back with an old teddy bear, its fur worn thin in patches, one ear reattached with a lopsided stitch of purple thread. "This is Captain Brown," she said gravely, presenting him like an honored guest. "He's older than me." Ethan took the bear carefully. It was heavier than it looked, the stuffing packed and repacked by time and tiny hands. A small plastic button was sewn into the paw, nearly invisible in the matted fur. His chest tightened without reason. "Hello, Captain," he said, because it felt necessary. "He remembers things," Sophie whispered, stepping closer as if they were conspiring. "Even when we forget." A laugh tried to escape him, half joy, half heartbreak. "Does he?" "Press here," she instructed, guiding his finger to the paw. He did. Static crackled, then a low voice filled the room, tinny and warm even through the years. His voice, unmistakable in its rough edges, its awkward tenderness. He felt it before he understood it, like recognizing your own handwriting in a stranger's letter. The melody that followed was not the melody of power or speeches or earnings calls. It was crooked and simple and full of small mistakes that made it truer. "Go to sleep, my little star," the recording sang, a beat late on the second note, a breath caught on the third. "I will count the ships that sail, I will count them from afar." Ethan's vision wavered. The room blurred at the edges, and the floor seemed to tilt a fraction. He braced the bear against his thigh, as if steadying a lantern in a high wind. The voice continued, speaking between lines in a whisper meant for exactly one person. "Stars are like promises," the recorded him said softly, almost laughing at himself. "Even when you can't see them, they're still there." Sophie's eyes were on his face, wide and patient. "Is it you?" she asked, in case the answer needed time to arrive. He could not speak for a moment. The recording ended with a clumsy hum and a small, unguarded chuckle. He pressed the button again. The same voice, the same imperfect tune, the same sentence he had heard only as an echo since the photograph in Midtown. "It's me," he managed, the words breaking. "It's me." He sank onto the couch because his knees did not trust themselves. The second playthrough brought something else with it. A sensation that wasn't only sound. Leather creaked. A chair rocked. He smelled baby shampoo and warm cotton and the faint metallic whisper of radiator steam. He felt a small weight across his chest, the precise pressure of an infant's head under his chin, the map of bones easing beneath, a heartbeat sinking to his own. He did not see a picture. He inhabited a room he could not name. Sophie climbed onto the couch beside him, careful as a scientist in a lab. "We used to press it when I was scared," she said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes you sang wrong. That made me laugh." "I hear that," he said, because he could, and the laugh that came out of him was a sound he had not made in years. He pressed the paw again and listened to himself be ordinary and lost in love. The front door clicked and Grace stepped in, tote bag on her shoulder, keys landing in the dish with a bell's bright chime. She froze at the sight. Ethan holding the bear, Sophie tucked against his side, the echo of a lullaby dissolving into the apartment's hum. "What's that?" Grace asked, though her eyes already knew. Sophie answered without turning. "Captain Brown. He remembers things." Grace set down the tote with more care than necessary. "I've been looking for him for months," she said softly. "He was behind the bookcase." "Of course he was." She crossed the room and stood by the arm of the couch, not quite sitting, not quite leaving. "Press it again." Ethan did. Grace's face changed as if a window had opened somewhere no one else could see. She leaned her hip against the armrest, hands folded, head bowing for a moment. When the recording ended, she exhaled, a sound of landing. "You recorded it the first week we brought her home," she said. "You were terrified you'd forget the words. You were wrong about the words." His throat was tight. "I forgot the room instead." "You're remembering it," she said, and though her voice held no exclamation, hope threaded it fine as silk. He nodded, and for once the nod did not feel like performance. "Pieces," he said. "Edges. Weight and warmth and the way the radiator hissed like a tired cat." Grace's mouth curved. "You hated that radiator." "I loved that radiator," he said, and meant it so completely the three of them laughed. They played it twice more, not because it would change, but because it changed them. The third time, Ethan heard his own breath on the recording and realized he had been weeping quietly in the past, too, in that room where the chair creaked and the city bent around their window like a giant listening. Sophie slid off the couch, retrieved a blanket from her room, the one with planets, and returned to lay it over his knees as if she were tucking the memory into place. "For when you forget," she said simply. "I will try not to," he answered. "Trying counts," she informed him, and reached for the bear to press the paw once more. "Wait," Grace said gently. She sat now at the far cushion, angled toward them. "Let's not wear it out tonight. Let it be special." Sophie considered this wisdom and conceded. "Okay, but we have to give Captain Brown a ceremony." "What kind of ceremony?" Ethan asked. "A putting away ceremony," she said. "We put him somewhere safe so he can do remembering work while we sleep." Grace lifted an eyebrow at Ethan, the smallest negotiation passing between them and landing on the side of yes. Together they cleared a spot on the highest shelf of the bookcase between Goodnight Moon and a field guide to constellations. Sophie stood on the couch arm while Ethan steadied her, and Grace steadied them both. They placed Captain Brown on his perch, paws folded, a small guardian of a room that had learned to hold past and future at once. "Now he can hear the stars," Sophie whispered. "Now we can, too," Ethan said. They ate soup at the small table, nothing elaborate but the kind of simple meal that stitches a day shut. Sophie insisted on using the planet spoon. Grace told a story about a neighbor's dog that had learned to open the lobby door with a nose push. Ethan listened more than he spoke, cataloging the minute sounds that might be keys later. Spoon against bowl, chair leg tap. Sophie's breath landing on the syllables she loved. When dishes were stacked and the night had cooled the room, Grace looked at him without flinching. "Tomorrow is parent-teacher conferences," she said. 3 slots. I told Mrs. Rivera you'd come if you could." "I will," he said. "I want to." "Then be there," she answered, not unkindly. "Don't let her look at the door and wait." He nodded. "I won't." Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Say goodnight, Captain," she prompted, pointing to the bear on the shelf. Ethan stood and saluted the small sentry, feeling foolish and relieved. "Good night, Captain. Hold the line." Sophie approved. "He will." At the door, with the hallway light cutting a brighter bar across the floor, Ethan hesitated. Grace stood with one hand on the frame, the other at her side, as if unsure which way would keep the air steady. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me—" "You're not a guest," she interrupted softly. "You're either in or you're not. Decide with your feet." "I am," he said, and the sentence felt like a plank laid between 2 cliffs. "I'm in." She searched his face, then inclined her head the smallest degree. 3:15, Mr. Walker." 3:15, he echoed. "Not late." He stepped into the corridor, listening to the apartment sounds fall back into themselves, the radiator's long sigh, the whisper of Grace turning off the lamp, Sophie's stage whisper conferring with Captain Brown. On the stairs, he stopped and pressed his palms to the cool wall, steadying the flood of sensation that wasn't quite a memory and wasn't quite not. He drew out his recorder and spoke quietly into the phone's glow. Note: Captain Brown, recorded lullaby, my voice, physical recall, chair creak, baby weight, radiator hiss, soap and cotton. Phrases: little star, count the ships, stars are promises, emotion, relief that hurts, action, be at school on time, no excuses. He slipped the phone away and the night received him. The city was what it had always been, loud, indifferent, magnificent. But somewhere a bear held the line on a small shelf, and a man who had learned to steer storms felt, for the first time in years, that he might learn again how to steer home. The autumn air carried a sharper bite that evening, as if the city itself were cutting away pretense. Ethan walked the familiar route to Hicks Street with his shoulders hunched against the chill, though the real weight pressing down wasn't weather. He had heard his own voice in a teddy bear, had felt memories tug at his bones like invisible strings, but still the picture of his life remained broken, pieces refusing to settle into place. Grace answered the door slowly. Sophie was already asleep, her backpack slumped against the wall like a tired sentinel. The apartment glowed in quiet lamplight, a hush that made the radiator's hiss sound louder. Grace stepped aside without a word, motioning him in. They sat at the kitchen table, a chipped surface bearing the scars of meals and homework battles. Grace wrapped her fingers around a mug, though she didn't drink. Ethan waited, letting the silence stretch. He had learned enough to know Grace spoke only when the weight of truth left her no choice. Finally, she set the mug down and looked him squarely in the eyes. "Do you really want to know who you were?" The question hit harder than an accusation. He swallowed. Yes. Then you need to hear all of it, she said. Not just the parts Sophie paints with crayons. Her voice carried no malice, only a brittle resolve. She began slowly, like a doctor probing a wound. You were brilliant, she said. That was never in doubt. You built Walker Global into something nobody thought possible. But you wore two faces. One belonged to the man Sophie adored, the one who made pirate voices and called raisins doubloons. The other was the man who listened to whispers from people like Richard Hale. Ethan stiffened at the name, but she continued. You started to change long before the accident. Hale fed you messages. He knew how to twist things. He showed you texts, emails, proof, he said, that I was meeting someone else, that I was lying to you. You confronted me, but you didn't wait for answers. You believed him. And once you believed, everything else followed. Her eyes glistened, though she didn't let tears fall. You told me I'd ruined you, that I was nothing but a distraction. You walked out before Sophie's 5th birthday. She cried herself to sleep clutching that teddy bear. I told her you were busy. I lied because I couldn't tell her the truth, that her father chose numbers over his own family. Ethan gripped the table edge, knuckles pale. Fragments of sensation burst behind his eyes, shouted words in a penthouse, slammed doors, Sophie's small sobs muffled by walls. But they came like shards, slicing without forming a hole. His head throbbed. Grace's voice softened, though steel underpinned it. And then the accident came. They said you were lucky to survive. When I heard, I thought maybe you'd remember the promises, not the poison. But then you disappeared. Papers filed. My name erased from records. Sophie's existence denied. I thought you chose to vanish completely. Ethan pressed his palms against his skull as if to hold it together. The pain surged, sharp, insistent, accompanied by flashes too quick to frame, headlights exploding into white, glass shattering, a smell of burning rubber, Grace's voice screaming through static. I didn't. He forced words through the storm. I didn't choose this. Grace reached across the table, her hand hovering near his but not touching. If you're telling the truth, then someone chose for you. Someone wanted you broken enough to forget. But Sophie and I lived with the consequences, not Richard Hale, not the board. Us. Ethan gasped, vision swimming. He pushed back from the table, nearly knocking the chair over. His body folded against the counter as waves of pain clawed through him. It's coming, he whispered, though he didn't know what it was. Grace rose quickly, steadying him without crowding. Breathe, Ethan. Just breathe. Let it come. The headache pulsed with images, jagged but real. Sophie's first steps on a hardwood floor. Grace laughing, flour dust on her cheek, in a kitchen bathed in afternoon sun. Then the crueler fragments, Hale's smug face across a bar table, an anonymous text blinking with accusation, his own voice raised too loud. Shame bit deeper than pain. I see both men, Ethan choked out. The one who held her, and the one who left. God. Grace. What if I was always the second? Grace shook her head, fierce now. You were both. That's what nearly destroyed us. But Sophie only remembers one. The father who made her feel safe. You still have the choice which face you wear now. Her words struck like a gavel. Slowly the headache ebbed, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Ethan slumped into the chair again, hands trembling. Grace poured water and slid the glass toward him. He drank, though his throat felt raw. Silence stretched, heavy but less brittle than before. Grace studied him, her gaze equal parts accusation and search. Do you understand why I don't trust you yet? She asked quietly. Yes, he whispered. But I want to earn it back. Not with promises, those I broke, with presence, with staying. For the first time, Grace's hand closed over his, not tightly, not forgiving yet, but as if testing the strength of something long abandoned. Then stay long enough to fight the man who took the first face from you. The weight of her words settled like a mandate. Ethan nodded slowly, breathing through the remnants of pain. He had lived with two faces, one Grace still feared, one Sophie still believed in. Now he had to choose which to carry forward. When he left that night, the city felt sharper, more alive. Neon lights cut through the fog, taxis honked, steam curled from subway grates. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't running from blankness. He carried fragments, painful, imperfect, undeniable. And in those fragments, a resolve hardened. The man with two faces would have to become one before Richard Hale could erase him forever. The Hudson glimmered steel gray in the distance as Ethan's car pulled up to the side entrance of Walker Global Holdings. He had chosen to arrive without entourage, without schedule, without the theater of power that normally trailed him. Today was not for appearances. Today was for truth. Inside, the building thrummed with the cold pulse of business. Suits flowed through corridors. Elevators swallowed and spat out assistants burdened with binders, screens lit with numbers that decided fates. Ethan ignored them all and took the stairs down, where the offices were less polished and more practical. He wasn't headed to the boardroom, he was headed to the man who knew where bodies, financial and otherwise, were buried. Noah Clark, Walker's internal auditor, had once been Ethan's classmate at Wharton. Quiet, meticulous, overlooked by men like Richard Hale because he didn't play golf or smile at cocktail parties. But Noah kept ledgers like a priest guarding scripture. Ethan found him hunched over spreadsheets in an office with no windows and two flickering lamps. "Noah," Ethan said. The man nearly spilled his coffee. "Jesus. Ethan, you can't just—" His voice lowered when he saw Ethan's face. "You look like you've been hit by a truck." "Close enough," Ethan said dryly. He shut the door. "I need everything on Marwick Capital. Contracts, transfers, side letters. Quietly." Noah blinked. "That's Hale's pet project. You signed off on the initial expansion yourself." "Then show me why," Ethan replied, his voice flat. "Because I don't remember signing my family out of existence either, and apparently that's in the records too." Noah's eyes sharpened. He didn't ask more questions. Instead, he pulled a folder from the drawer with the speed of a man who'd been waiting for this call. "I hoped you'd ask someday." The documents were a tangle of numbers, but Ethan's eyes, trained for acquisition, spotted the thread. Funds routed through shell subsidiaries, assets pledged twice, clauses buried in footnotes that would shift controlling interest if Ethan was incapacitated. One clause stood out. In the event of prolonged incapacity of CEO, executive authority will be transferred to CFO Richard Hale, subject to oversight by board member Paige Collier. Ethan's breath hitched. "Collier," he muttered. "Exactly," Noah said grimly. "Hale and Collier together own a quiet majority through Marwick. You were supposed to be out of the picture for good. The accident, well, it came at the perfect time, didn't it?" Ethan gripped the edge of the desk. Flashes sparked in his mind. Collier leaning too close at a board dinner. Hale's hand firm on his shoulder after a shareholders' meeting, their reassurances ringing hollow even then. He pressed his palm to his temple, chasing the fragments. "They erased my family," he said, the words tasting like iron. "Then they rewrote my company." Noah hesitated. "Ethan, you need to be careful. Hale has reach." "He'll know you're digging." "I want him to know," Ethan said coldly. "Let him feel the ground crack." Noah studied him, then slid a USB drive across the desk. "I've been compiling for months. Copies of every suspicious transfer, emails they thought were deleted. Enough to burn them down if you're ready to light the match. Ethan pocketed it. I am. The city outside seemed louder when he emerged, as if the world had eavesdropped. He walked briskly toward the garage, scanning faces, ears tuned to footsteps. That was when he saw it. A black sedan idling across the street, tinted windows, engine purring too softly to be casual. He forced himself not to stop, not to stare. He entered his car, motioning to the driver. Circled twice before home. The sedan slipped into traffic behind them. Grace's voice echoed in his head. If you're telling the truth, someone chose this for you. His hand curled around the USB in his pocket. Whoever was in that sedan already knew. He couldn't let Grace or Sophie be near the crossfire. Drop me 3 blocks from Hicks Street, he told his driver. You go back to the garage. I'll walk. The driver frowned but obeyed. Ethan stepped into the evening air. Brooklyn's streets smelled of rain and bread from a nearby bakery. He cut down an alley, senses alert. The sedan didn't follow. Not here. Not yet. By the time he reached Grace's building, his heart had steadied. He found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot with the distracted rhythm of someone who used cooking to outpace worry. Sophie sat at the table, crayons spread like constellations. You're early, Grace said, not looking up. Needed to be, Ethan answered. He placed a hand lightly on Sophie's shoulder. Go finish your drawing in your room, Captain. I need to talk with your mom. Sophie obeyed without fuss, humming as she gathered her papers. When the bedroom door clicked shut, Ethan pulled the USB from his pocket and set it on the counter. This is proof, he said. Hale and Collier. They planned the takeover. The accident wasn't random, it was opportunity. And they've been watching me ever since. Grace's spoon stilled. And now they'll be watching us. Yes, Ethan admitted. That's why you need to be careful. No late walks alone, no strange cars. If anything feels wrong, you call me. Immediately. Grace met his eyes. Fear flickered there, but so did something else. A recognition that he wasn't running anymore. You think you can fight them? I have to, Ethan said simply. For this family. For the one they tried to erase. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she closed the pot lid and turned off the burner. Then we fight smart. No grand speeches, no heroics that get you killed. We use the truth. Carefully. He almost smiled. Agreed. That night, Ethan stood by Sophie's bed while she drifted to sleep, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. Grace leaned in the doorway, arms crossed but not in defense this time. Sophie murmured, eyes half closed. Stars are promises. Ethan's chest tightened. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Yes, Captain, and promises don't break. He turned, meeting Grace's gaze. For the first time, she nodded, a fragile truce, a recognition that the fight was not only his anymore. Outside, unseen in the street below, the black sedan idled again, engine humming, headlights dim. Watching. Waiting. The courthouse on Pearl Street had seen its share of giants fall. Financial titans, mob bosses, politicians who thought themselves untouchable. All of them had walked its marble halls under the glare of cameras. This morning, Ethan Walker joined their ranks. He stood on the courthouse steps flanked not by bodyguards, but by Grace on one side and Noah on the other. Sophie clutched Grace's hand tightly, her small knuckles white. Protesters and reporters jostled for space, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Mr. Walker, is it true your CFO orchestrated your accident? Do you deny falsifying records about your family? Is Walker Holdings collapsing under scandal? Ethan kept his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors ahead. No comment, he said, voice even, and pushed forward. Inside, the air cooled, heavy with marble silence. The federal courtroom rose before them, dark benches, polished rails, the seal of the United States presiding like an unblinking eye. Richard Hale was already there, seated at the defense table in a tailored suit the color of smoke. His smile when he saw Ethan was sharp enough to cut glass. Beside him sat Paige Collier, her pearl necklace gleaming, her posture serene as if she were attending a gala, not a trial. Grace stiffened beside Ethan. He felt her hand brush his briefly, grounding him. Sophie had been escorted to a private waiting room by a court officer, safer there than in the gallery. Ethan's chest ached at the sight of her disappearing around the corner, but he nodded. Keep her safe, he told the officer. The trial began with the usual rituals, opening statements, evidence logs, motions read into record. Hale's lawyers painted him as a loyal executive accused by a paranoid CEO whose memory was suspect. They leaned heavily on the word amnesia, as though it were a weapon. But when Ethan's counsel rose, Noah's USB drive in hand, the atmosphere shifted. Exhibit 14, the attorney said, voice steady. A digital log recovered from NYU Langone Medical Center, room 412. The screen lit up with files, correspondence, edit trails, the kind of metadata Hale had once thought invisible. Each revision bore the same mark, RH. Each erasure of Grace's name, each deletion of Sophie's existence, each convenient adjustment. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Collier's lips thinned. Hale's jaw ticked, though his smile held. Then the attorney produced the second file, an audio fragment dated 2 years earlier. Ethan's chest seized. We ask permission to play a recovered recording, the attorney said. The judge nodded. From the speakers, a voice filled the courtroom, Hale's, unmistakable, low, and confident. The accident buys us time. With Walker incapacitated, authority shifts by clause to me. Collier secures the board. His family ties, already erased. By the time he remembers, he'll have nothing to return to. The gallery erupted. The gavel slammed. Hale's composure cracked for the first time, his lawyer whispering furiously. Collier stared straight ahead, pearls suddenly heavy on her throat. Ethan's hands trembled. The proof was undeniable. Yet before relief could land, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Grace gasped. A man in a dark coat entered, his eyes scanning until they locked on her. His stride quickened. "Grace," Ethan hissed, rising instantly. The man reached into his coat. For a split second, Ethan's world shrank to a tunnel. The courtroom blurred. He moved before thought, crossing the aisle in a single stride, pulling Grace behind him as marshals closed in. The man's hand emerged not with a weapon but with a folded note. He dropped it as the marshals tackled him, dragging him out in a storm of curses. The note fluttered to the floor. Ethan bent and caught it. 3 words scrawled in jagged ink. Leave or lose. Grace's hand tightened on his arm. "They'll go after Sophie," she whispered. In that moment, something inside Ethan broke open. Memory surged, not shards this time, but floods. Sophie as an infant in his arms, the exact weight of her head under his chin. Grace leaning against him on a ferry, her laugh carried by the wind. The smell of cinnamon in a kitchen, Sophie's small voice demanding another pirate story. It hit like a tidal wave. He staggered, clutching the bench, eyes burning. "Mr. Walker?" the judge asked sharply. Ethan lifted his head. For the first time in years, he remembered it all. Every promise made, every betrayal, every face. And most of all, the family stolen from him. He straightened, voice clear. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. My company was hijacked, my memory tampered with, my family erased. But not anymore. I remember. And I will not let them take anything further. Grace's eyes shone, tears she no longer tried to hide. The jury watched as the recording replayed, Hale's voice damning him with his own words. The tide had turned. Outside in the hall during recess, Ethan finally gathered Grace and Sophie together. Sophie ran into his arms, confusion in her small face. What happened? Why are you crying? He pulled her close, pressing his lips to her hair. Because I remember, Captain, he whispered. I remember everything, and I'm never leaving again. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, as if sealing the vow. Grace stood near, tears falling freely now, but her gaze steady. She no longer looked at a stranger. She looked at the man she had once loved, and perhaps could again. In the distance, Hale shouted at his lawyers, but his empire was already crumbling. For the first time, Ethan knew the fight was no longer about survival. It was about justice, and this time, justice had a voice. Spring had finally broken over New York, softening the hard lines of the city. Trees along the Hudson Valley unfurled green like cautious hope, and for the first time in years, Ethan Walker allowed himself to exhale. The trial was over. Richard Hale sat in custody, awaiting sentencing. Paige Collier had withdrawn from every board she once dominated, her fortune bleeding into restitution. Walker Global Holdings stood scarred but intact, run now by people Ethan trusted to carry it forward. And Ethan himself? He had walked away. On a quiet afternoon, he stood barefoot on the porch of a clapboard house north of Tarrytown. The wood was rough beneath his feet, honest and unpolished. Grace was painting the railing, auburn hair tied back with an old scarf. Sophie played in the yard, building castles out of cardboard boxes, her laughter scattering into the air like birds. This house still needs a new roof, Grace said, her voice carrying over the hum of cicadas. I'll learn, Ethan answered. He tapped the hammer in his hand. I used to build empires out of glass and steel. Maybe I should try something that actually keeps rain out. She smiled, faint but real. As long as you don't draw up a 200-page contract for it. He chuckled, easing onto the porch swing beside her. The world felt smaller here, but also larger in the ways that mattered. Inside, the bookshelves bore evidence of a different kind of wealth. Treasure Island with its worn spine, fairy tales Sophie had outgrown but still insisted on keeping, medical guides Grace used for her clinic shifts. In a corner, a room had been cleared for Grace's dream, a lending library and children's nook. Boxes of donated books waited to be sorted, each one a seed for futures she hoped to nurture. Sophie came running up the steps, crown of paper stars tilted on her head. Daddy, look! She held out a drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands under a sky filled with stars. It's us. I made the stars really big so you don't forget them. Ethan's throat tightened. He crouched to eye level, taking the paper as if it were gold leaf. I won't forget. Not ever again. She threw her arms around his neck, and he felt the unmistakable weight of home. That evening, the 3 of them ate spaghetti on the porch. Sophie told them about her new teacher, about a snail named Speedy in the classroom, about how she planned to be both a pirate and a doctor when she grew up. Grace laughed, correcting her gently, but Ethan only listened, absorbing every word as though each was an anchor fastening him to this life. Daddy, Sophie said suddenly, serious now. Do you remember everything? Ethan put down his fork. The porch was quiet but for the chorus of crickets. Grace watched him carefully, waiting. "Not everything," he admitted. "Some days the memories come like photographs, some days like fog. But I remember the night you were born. I remember holding you, promising you the stars. I remember your mother's laugh being the first home I ever had. And I remember what matters most now, that I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Sophie smiled, satisfied, and went back to twirling spaghetti. Grace's eyes shimmered, tears she didn't wipe away. Later, when Sophie was asleep, they sat together on the porch swing. The Hudson shimmered in moonlight, the river carrying away old shadows. "I didn't think we'd get here," Grace whispered. "Neither did I," Ethan said. "For a while I thought my life was gone, my memory, my family, my worth. But Sophie, she pulled me back." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're different now." "Better?" he asked softly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Not perfect, but present. That's what matters." He wrapped an arm around her. "Then present is what I'll be. Every Tuesday, every Friday, every late night when Sophie has a nightmare. I won't just send flowers. I'll be here." The porch swing creaked. Fireflies lit the grass below, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt whole. Not because every memory had returned, but because his heart was no longer divided. On Sophie's 7th birthday, neighbors gathered in the yard. Children ran through sprinklers, parents brought pies, and laughter spilled across the valley. Grace unveiled shelves of books in the children's nook, painted and filled. A hand-painted sign above read, "Hudson Little Library. Free books, free dreams." Ethan raised a glass of lemonade. His words were awkward but true. "Once I thought legacy was measured in towers and contracts. Now I know it's measured in promises kept, in laughter on porches, in stories read before bed, to family, found, remembered, and never forgotten again." Applause rose, but it was Sophie's squeal as she blew out her candles that sealed the day. That night, after the guests had gone, Ethan tucked Sophie into bed. She wore her paper crown, edges frayed, but she refused to take it off. "Daddy," she mumbled sleepily, "can we stay here forever?" He kissed her forehead. "Yes, we're home, and we're staying." She drifted into dreams, breathing even and sure. Ethan lingered by the door, watching. Grace joined him, her hand slipping into his. They stood in silence, the sound of Sophie's steady breathing behind them, the river outside carrying the night forward. For Ethan Walker, the man who had once lost everything to shadows and deceit, home was no longer a question. It was a promise, one he would spend the rest of his life keeping. ChatGPT Danai, thank you for staying with us until the very last chapter of Ethan, Grace, and Sophie's journey, a story of memory, redemption, and the simple power of coming home. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and join us for more healing tales of love, hope, and second chances.